Hello, I'm Michael Serapio. Well, Mark Carney is standing by a Liberal candidate in a riding just north of Toronto, calling it a teachable moment. Now, that candidate is Paul Chiang. First elected in 2021, he is running again in the riding of Markham-Unionville. But back in January, Chiang told a Chinese-language newspaper people could make money if they handed over Conservative rival Joe Tay to the Chinese consulate in Toronto. Tay helped co-found the pro-democracy Hong Konger station. He also runs a channel on YouTube. And late last year, Beijing issued a bounty on him for criticizing the PRC's crackdown of Hong Kong. 1 million Hong Kong dollars, or about 182,000 Canadian dollars, for information leading to Tay's arrest. Dozens of Hong Kong diaspora groups are calling on the Liberals to drop Chiang for that comment. But this is what we heard from the Liberal leader today.
Mr. Chiang is a veteran policeman with more than a quarter century of service to his community. 28 years of defending rights in this community, and he will continue with his candidacy going forward, having made those apologies very clearly to the individual, to the community, and moving forward to serve.
Mark Carney standing up for Paul Chiang. Now, we should note that Joe Tay is running for the Conservatives in another Toronto area riding in this election, this one in the city itself, Don Valley North. And take a listen to what we heard from the Conservative and NDP leaders reacting to Carney's response today.
Joe Tay is extremely afraid. He's afraid for his life. And I think he is probably rattled by the fact that the Prime Minister of Canada is siding with a Liberal MP who has made these horrific and dangerous comments against a Canadian citizen, against the life of a fellow Canadian citizen.
And to hear a candidate for the Liberal Party effectively say, go out and get the bounty on my opponent's head, it is really scary to hear that. For those folks, it's really disturbing. And for Mark Carney to say that I'm going to accept this candidate really sends a message that that type of commentary ultimately is acceptable, because he's not removing him as a candidate.
Well, for his thoughts on this issue, we're now joined by Marcus Kolga, Senior Fellow at the Royal Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights. He is also one of 3 Canadians who have been sanctioned by both China and Russia for exposing oppression and intimidation. Mr. Kolga, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Michael.
So we just heard the Liberal leader standing by Mr. Chiang. You yourself have been sanctioned by China, the PRC, for writing about Chinese intimidation and diaspora groups. What's your reaction to the fact that Mr. Carney refuses to drop this candidate?
Well, it's extremely disappointing, and it's really a betrayal of democracy, transnational repression against Canadians, thousands of Canadians, of Chinese, Uyghur, Tibetan heritage, also human rights activists, is a very serious issue, one that was discussed for much of last year through the Hogue Commission, and in her final report, Madame Hogue clearly defined and made clear that transnational repression is a significant threat to our democracy. So to have the leader of the Liberal Party, the Prime Minister of Canada, sort of just dismiss Mr. Chiang's sort of participation almost in Chinese government transnational repression is deeply disappointing, and again I think will make Canadians question the trust that they have in the Prime Minister and in our democracy.
Well, to your point, the NGO Hong Kong Watch, which is patroned by the last British governor of Hong Kong, is now asking the RCMP to investigate Mr. Chiang for potentially violating Canada's Foreign Interference and Security Information Act. Do you think this needs to be investigated as a potential violation of Canadian law?
Well, look, I mean, transnational repression is a serious concern. We have new legislation, Bill C-70, that was passed last year to try and deal with transnational repression. And so if there was any potential violation of that law or any others that are intended to protect Canadian citizens and our democracy, 100% they should be investigated. And the fact that Hong Kong Watch has issued this letter, that needs to be taken seriously by both the government and the RCMP and any other law enforcement units at any level of government that may be applicable.
Now, Mr. Carney is relatively new to politics, but his party has been criticized in the past for not reacting quickly or strongly enough to foreign interference. By defending Mr. Chiang, are Liberals right now living up to that reputation?
Well, I think, unfortunately, so. I mean, this is a clear case of a dismissal of a case of transnational repression. Whether Mr. Chiang was joking or not in suggesting that Canadians should take someone who was potentially going to be a political opponent to one of either the Chinese consulate or one of these Chinese government police stations in Canada to collect a bounty, it's neither funny. It's a very serious sort of suggestion to make, and so, like I said, if there's any suggestion that he may have violated Canadian laws in doing so, those need to be investigated.
Okay. Now you say that this is serious, and so I want to pick up on that point because I wonder what you think, or perhaps even fear, the impact of this decision to stand with Mr. Chiang will have on diaspora groups in this country.
Well, look, the clip earlier clearly outlined Mr. Chiang's own background. He's was a member of the York Region Police Force for 28 years. He was a member of Parliament and a parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Immigration. That he has a moral obligation to defend all Canadians, whether it's part of diaspora minority groups, whether it's human rights activists. That is a trust that we have bestowed in that individual. He has clearly broken that trust. And I think that diaspora communities, other Canadians who are vulnerable to transnational repression, this is going to send a chill throughout those communities. Again, it's a question of trust and trusting our government, our elected members of Parliament, to defend them. When they start essentially collaborating with a foreign authoritarian regime in their efforts to try and intimidate and silence critics and opponents of that regime, that's a very, very serious concern. And that is, quite frankly, a threat to the integrity of our democracy and, again, the trust that we place in our elected officials.
Okay, you use the term moral obligation. Does Mr. Chiang have the moral obligation to resign, pull out of this race? And if not, does Mr. Carney have the moral obligation to get rid of this candidate?
I think Mr. Carney, as the Prime Minister of Canada, as the leader of the Liberal Party, has a moral obligation. His party has a moral obligation to remove this individual as a candidate. It's entirely up to Mr. Chiang himself what he decides to do, but certainly the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party do have a moral obligation to act, and to act immediately.
Now, you live in the riding where that Mr. Chiang actually represents, Mr. Kolga. What's been the reaction to this around you in your own neighborhood? Well,
look, I don't think that Mr. Chiang himself is all that well known even within the riding. I think, talking to neighbors, they'd be hard pressed to identify who the member of Parliament, quite frankly, is. And so, the reaction that I'm hearing specifically from members of the Hong Kong, Tibetan, and Uyghur communities, including those that live within the riding, is of deep concern and deep disappointment, not just in Mr. Chiang's comments, but the fact that Mr. Carney himself has not reacted, has not removed Mr. Chiang yet. And so like I said, there's very deep concern amongst those, specifically those communities who are impacted by transnational repression right here in the riding. And I'd have to say myself, as a human rights activist, someone who has been targeted by both Russia and China, it's deeply concerning for me. I don't feel like I would feel comfortable being in the same room with Mr. Chiang at this point, or being anywhere near him, given his remarks, because again, we don't know whether he was joking or serious. And so, if we're unsure of that, and his proximity to the Chinese government, it's again a very, very deep concern for all of us.
Marcus Kolga, I appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thanks for having me on, Michael.